Cosmism?
What is it? So Cosmism is a Russian-born philosophy which combines modern science and values from Orthodox Christianity, or at least that's what it was founded on. And it encompasses the idea of active evolution and how the human mind is capable of evolving to the point of being able to alter the laws of nature. Cosmism was one of the first modern transhumanist philosophies where it basically, in the context of the late 19th century, early 20th century, it is about how the goal of the human race is to achieve immortality and evolve into something new altogether. And in doing so, we would enter a new phase in history, which civilization diverts to its primary directive, which is to expand across the universe and colonize other planets, creating a socialist utopia. It was heavily intertwined with the idea of existentialism. What is humanity's purpose? What is life's purpose? And this was a philosophy a niche philosophy, exclusive to a small group of people. So intellectuals, philosophers, scientists, anarchists. And it encompasses some key themes such as death, resurrection, immortality, God's will, transplanetary society, colonization, and socialist utopia. First up is Nikolai Fyodorov. So Nikolai Fyodorov was a philosopher, teacher. He was a librarian at the Rumyantsev Museum, right across from the Kremlin, and he was a very religious man. He lived on very poor means, bread, tea, water. He was not poor. He was not raised poor. He was the son of a statesman, and he did have education, but he was widely self-taught. He's considered to be the founder of Russian Cosmism and was also known by peers as the Socrates of Moscow. His works focused largely on death, or what he called общее дело, the common cause, and he did not like the idea that only future generations would be able to live in this socialist utopia that people were working for. He considered it man's mission to achieve resurrection on earth in spirit of Christ's resurrection in Orthodox Christianity. And he saw it as man's duty to resurrect his forefathers so they too would have that luxury. Now, once procreation becomes obsolete and humans have achieved immortality, the human race can now divert its focus to cosmic expansion and understanding of the universe. A genuine socialist society for him, it could only be a interplanetary society, because now that we've achieved resurrection and immortality, there's a population problem, and utopias don't have population problems. Therefore, the human race must be capable of colonizing outer space. He really did believe all scripture should be interpreted literally. His concepts were not widely read. Often they were considered sacrilegious, but the people who did read them were heavily intrigued. Revolutionaries were thoroughly inspired by the idea that you could give your life for the socialist cause and be resurrected one day when the socialist utopia has been built. Next up is Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky was thoroughly inspired by Fyodorov. They actually met in the Moscow Library, and he was a founding father of modern rocket science, a very famous aerospace engineer. He became an architect of the early Soviet space program, and he was very well known and awarded for his achievements. There were streets named after him. He was on stamps. And he also had lesser known philosophical publications, and they were thoroughly inspired by Fyodorov and biocosmism. He was entranced by the idea of colonizing space. In his publication, The Will of the Universe, he talks about how all molecules can experience happiness and pain. There's the experience of stone, which would be numb, and then humans, will one day be capable of feeling everything. It's this like angels and stone juxtaposition he talks about. He basically believes in his mind that eventually humans will be able to evolve to the point where they can dissolve into like exceed humanity. And he, although he was a vegetarian, he believed that all animals and most plants should be wiped out, and that only angels and stone should exist. It was the extermination of inferior life and breeding of a superhuman race capable of traveling between planets. This leads us to the biocosmist immortalists. So these people were a small faction of intellectuals who they themselves had split off of another ideological faction, the anarchist universalists. So this was a very small group of people, and their manifesto was published in 1921, and it was written by Alexander Svetogor. In it, they basically demand for all of the concepts that Fyodorov and Tsiolkovsky had conceptualized. Basically, it's the goal of society and the state to achieve immortality, achieve resurrection, and colonize space. They specifically viewed death itself as a unacceptable social problem. Svetogor himself, he furthers Fyodorov's concept on and discussion on death by dividing death into two different types. He says that death is made up of bodily decomposition and then spiritual death, which he calls death in life. And by spiritual death, he means that one's spirit dies due to capitalism and private ownership. He even furthers Fyodorov's idea of an Earthship. So biocosmists were not interested in just understanding nature, but they wanted to change it. And there was a belief that Fyodorov had created that Earth could be used to leave the solar system and travel throughout space. Now, Lenin and Stalin were not very fond of the biocosmist immortalists. Lenin had kind of let them be for the sake of intellectualism, but by the time we got to the era of Stalin and the Great Terror, most of them were rid of and sent to camps. Svetogor himself was lost to time in Siberia. Lastly, I want to touch on Alexander Bogdanov. He was a co-founder of Bolshevism alongside Lenin, although they were later rivals because he disagreed on how Lenin emphasized dictatorial leadership, whereas he wanted to emphasize a worker-based society and the proletariat. And so he was also extremely inspired by Fyodorov's idea for the future. He was an early pioneer in blood transfusion because he was searching for immortality. He would take the blood from a younger person and transfer it to an older person and transfer the blood from the older person to the younger person. The older person is now revitalized, whereas the younger person gains wisdom. They even performed experiments on dog heads where they would reanimate dead dogs, and it was basically, they were trying to prove that they could resurrect people. And little did he know that his work would be the death of him, quite literally, because he dies from a blood transfusion because the blood was diseased, which is unfortunate. And so after he dies, that's kind of it for Cosmism, because he was the last person who really actually had power and really believed in Fyodorov's concepts. whereas the other people in the Biocosmist Immortalists didn't have the same power, and Stalin kind of just gets rid of them. And that's where we end.